Are Cheshire Police, in part, responsible for the murder of 16-year-old Brianna Ghey? That is the question that currently underpins a potential conflict of interest surrounding the ongoing investigation, an issue rooted in decades of police corruption. At the same time, debate regarding the supposed motive behind Brianna's murder has largely erased from discussion the fact that Brianna is known to have been the victim of years of anti-trans violence, allowing those responsible to wash their hands of said blood. These are just some of the issues we'll be covering in today's video. Though before we can discuss that, I of course need to give a content warning for the following: anti-trans hate crime, murder, bullying, suicidal ideation, misgendering, ableism, dead naming, sexual violence, and gender-critical fascism. I also need to give an additional disclaimer to my fellow trans people. You do not need to watch this video. There is a lot of trauma in the community right now, and if you're at all feeling like it's too much, then please give this video a pass. You can always come back if you change your mind, but please do not force yourself to watch. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and it's time for us to talk about the murder of Brianna Ghey. We have a lot to cover, so let's start with a general recap of events. On the 11th of January 2023, a person or persons stabbed 16-year-old Brianna Ghey inside Linear Park in Colchester. She was later found, an ambulance was called at 3:13 PM, yet sadly Brianna was pronounced dead at the scene. The police turned up, put out requests to speak to key witnesses, before later arresting two teenagers, a boy and a girl, both aged 15. Both suspects were subsequently charged and are currently awaiting trial, which is set to begin on the 10th of July. It is believed that this was a targeted attack and not, say, a botched mugging, meaning 16-year-old Brianna Ghey was singled out and murdered. When the media broke the story, many articles did not report the facts that Brianna Ghey was a trans girl. However, it wasn't long before certain papers began editing their stories to remove Brianna's real name and gender from places where they had been originally, with an article by the Sunday Times going so far as to include an entirely new paragraph containing Brianna's dead name, an act of transmisic violence specifically designed to hurt those mourning Brianna's death. This, thankfully, received substantial backlash by everyone with a sliver of a conscience, though this is pretty on par for the UK media. The same can be said of its politicians. Keir Starmer's silence on the tragedy has been deafening, effectively confirming that the Labour Party has abandoned its 1985 resolution to support the LGBT+ community. Similarly, a Lib Dem councillor for the town of Evesham, Julie Haynes, posted comments publicly mocking Brianna's death. In her comments, which were posted on the 17th of February to a Metro News article about Brianna's murder, Ms. Haynes misgendered Brianna, labelling her a, quote, poor boy, end quote. When pushed back on said statement, Ms. Haynes clarified her intent, adding that, quote, he was a deeply troubled boy, he needed help, end quote. Let's call out the first thing that smacks me in the face about this, and that's the faux concern. Like, it practically oozes from the screen whenever I look at her comments. For as much as Julie pretends to be upset, she's apparently not so moved as to mention the fact of Brianna's murder in either of her comments, nor treat Brianna with a foundational degree of respect by properly gendering her. On top of this, we have the way in which Ms. Haynes is weaponizing mental health, insinuating that Brianna was mentally ill because she was trans, hence the mention of her being deeply troubled and needing help. These are phrases typically associated with mental illness, which aligns with how many anti-trans bigots perceive trans people. Bigots, such as those who would boast about buying anti-trans propaganda pieces lying about the nature of the Tavistock closure. When an anti-trans bigot talks about helping trans youth, That is an anti-trans dog whistle, which stands for torture the trans out of them. In other words, Ms. Haynes is using the unrelated topic of alleged mental illness to deliberately distract from Brianna's murder whilst furthering key anti-trans myths, effectively gorging herself on Brianna's corpse in a despicable bid to fuel anti-trans hate and the violence it ultimately results in. Of course, it wasn't long before people began connecting the dots. Between 2012 and 2022, anti-trans hate crime has grown 13-fold. That is an increase of 1,282%. This, along with the facts that Brianna's murder had been targeted, led some to question whether anti-trans hate had been a motivating factor behind said murder. The police were quick to dismiss this line of thought, stating rather strongly that they saw no evidence to suggest that the murder had been hate-related, only to walk back on that statement a few days later, claiming that all lines of inquiry were now being investigated. Kinda makes you wonder why that hadn't been the case to begin with. Or at least it might if you're not a member of a marginalised community. The sad fact is, the UK police force has a sordid history of ignoring and even covering up hate crime. This is, in large part, thanks to a phenomenon known as Canteen culture, a set of conservative and discriminatory attitudes that exist within the British police force and are actively maintained. The British police are, in general, a very tight-knit community. Which sounds lovely. That is until you realise that they use said community to indirectly punish anyone who doesn't adhere to said attitudes, whilst rewarding those that do, including their fellow officers. This goes all the way to the very top, by the way, and is why every chief of police is as much a raging shitbag as your average grunt. The police force is actively rewarding terrible behaviour. And we know this. That is why, under UK hate crime law, the police are legally required to record and investigate any crime as a hate incident if the victim or anyone else involved so much as implies that hatred towards one of the 5 protected categories, that is, race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender identity, was involved in some way. All because the police cannot be trusted to act in the interest of marginalised victims. This issue is so common that organisations which offer free legal advice, like Citizens Advice, have entire sections dedicated to teaching people how to get police to do what they claim is their job. UK hate crime law exists as much to protect marginalised people from the prejudices of the police force as they do to escalate punishment for crimes against an entire demographic. If something is marked down as a hate incident during investigation, that brings with it additional oversight intended to protect the victim from a miscarriage of justice, and police do not like that one bit. Isn't it interesting how the people who justify routine violations of our civil rights on the basis of if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, seem to be awfully afraid of oversight for the job they're paid to do? That's what police bureaucracy is. Anytime you hear a police officer complain about how they have to fill out 3 or 4 separate reports when they arrest someone, each one of those reports exists because UK police found a way to abuse the system and were later caught. The amount of police paperwork directly correlates with the level of corruption inherent to the system. Corruption that marginalised people are acutely aware of. Regarding the LGBT+ community specifically, a Gallup hate crime report in 2021 revealed that only 1 in 8 respondents who had been made the victim of a hate crime, that's 13%, reported the incident to the police. And when it came to the reasons behind the decision not to report said hate crime, a massive 54% stated that they chose not to because they felt like police would do nothing, whilst 28% stated that they disliked or were afraid of the police. Just focusing on that last one for a second, that means 24%, almost a quarter, of all LGBT+ victims of hate crime in the UK are outright afraid of British police. And to those living in a fantasy land in which they believe there's no merit to these views, of the 13% who did report a hate crime, only 46% were satisfied with the police's response. That's less than half. And keeping in mind that the inverse 54% who weren't satisfied suffered everything from police simply not taking the issue seriously to police actually engaging in further hate crimes against members of the LGBT+ community, why would victims of anti-LGBT+ hate crimes flip a coin? That's worse odds than Russian roulette. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. By the way, these statistics are backed up by the UK government's own national LGBT survey published in 2018. When it came to trans people specifically, only 8.8% reported the most serious incident of hate crime they had experienced within the past 12 months when the culprit was someone they did not live with, a number that dropped down to 5.1% if it was a domestic incident. When it came to reasons for not reporting, among those who were victims of non-domestic hate incidents, 49.9% stated that they felt nothing would change, 33.6% stated that they felt they wouldn't be taken seriously, and 9.2% stated that they had personally had a bad experience reporting incidents in the past. Meanwhile, for domestic hate incidents, 45.4% stated that they felt nothing would change, 29.5% stated that they felt they wouldn't be taken seriously, and 8% stated that they had personally had a bad experience reporting incidents in the past. It's worth noting that the British government didn't think to include questions asking about the victim's perception of the police force, but I think the Gallup poll covers the missing context rather well. LGBT+ people do not trust police, trans people especially, and we have good reason not to. The police have done nothing but justify our fears in the past. That is why when the police come out and assert that there is no evidence a crime against an LGBT+ person was in any way hate-related, like with Brianna, we tend to eye that with suspicion. I think they call it probable cause. This is especially relevant considering how many people who knew Brianna when she was alive have come forward about the fact that she was routinely bullied at school for being trans. Remember that both people arrested were about her age. Damien Harry, the father of one of Brianna's friends, told the Mail, quote, "Brianna said she was devastated by the constant abuse and even talked of ending it all. It was down to her being trans. It is disgusting what happened," end quote, before going on to add, quote, "Let's be frank, she was bullied because of her sexuality. Of course, this is a hate crime," end quote. And statements about Brianna being bullied at school for being trans were echoed by Kenzie, one of Brianna's friends, who told the Rolling Stones, quote, "The police should be looking at the history of Brianna's bullying and make connections to get a better understanding of whether it was a hate crime or not," end quote, before also adding, quote, "I just know deep down it was a hate crime, and many other people in the community feel that way too," end quote. It's worth mentioning that all three friends that the Rolling Stones talked to brought up the fact that she was bullied at school for being transgender, something which was further corroborated by The Sun, with one of Brianna's friends stating, quote, "She had been bullied in school for years. The teachers obviously knew," end quote. Another friend then went on to add, quote, "She was bullied and gang beaten for years for the simple reason of being trans," end quote, before finishing with, quote, "Her high school and Cheshire police refused to intervene." End quote. It's also worth mentioning that Brianna was excluded from school 5 days before she was murdered, a fact which, when coupled with the age of the current suspects, being in her year group or the one just below hers, is a hell of a coincidence, one that makes me wonder if said exclusion had anything to do with her murder. If there's one thing schools hate more than anything else, it's a bullied kid taking a stand. Though, to be clear, this is speculation on my part. Returning to the assaults, this is why I say Brianna Ghey was a victim of anti-trans hate crime. Because she simply was. Hate crime doesn't start and end with being murdered. Being physically assaulted because you are trans is also a hate crime, one that both the school and Cheshire Police refused to act on. Brianna was instead forced to live in a state of constant fear because she was trans and just trying to live her life. A trans person comes out in a trans hostile society because they have no other option, because it is quite literally do or die. Yet she was punished for being trans, tormented by her peers to the point that she openly talked about taking her own life. The multiple sources that confirm that she was being targeted and even physically assaulted for being trans don't magically disappear now that someone murdered her. And we'll get to what this revelation means for the police in a minute. But first, I need to make some more general observations, starting with the fact that children aren't born with some innate sense of hatred. They learn it from the people around them, particularly the adults who promote and normalize hateful ideologies. It is thanks to the likes of J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, Rosie Duffield, Matt Walsh, Helen Joyce, Jordan Peterson, Julie Bindel, Stephen Woodford, the list goes on and on. It is thanks to these people and the outlets that publish them that Brianna was made to constantly suffer during the final years of her tragically short life, irrespective of whether said hatred was what ultimately finished her off. The people I have listed, those they commonly associate with, the outlets that publish them, and the mob which rushes to their defense each and every time they get called out for feeding the anti-trans hysteria, do not get to wash Brianna's blood off their hands. Even if they didn't kill her, they still went out of their way to make this 16-year-old girl's life a living nightmare, just as they are doing for every trans person in the UK. To show one example of precisely what I mean, less than a fortnight after Brianna was murdered, infamous anti-trans bigot Julie Bindel began tweeting an article she'd written for the Daily Mail. The article itself discussed a case in which a cis man used his position as a refuge handyman to sexually assault vulnerable women. And yet, in spite of this having absolutely nothing to do with trans women, self-ID or anything of that nature, Julie Bindel twisted said case of sexual violence to be the fault of trans women, including trans girls like Brianna. This constant lying by the anti-trans movement is why most people in the UK were fine with trans people having access to gender spaces as recently as 2018, a state that has now reversed, because the public has been fed nothing but a stream of propaganda by hate-filled bigots. And it's not like nobody saw this coming. I distinctly recall covering a rash of anti-trans assaults in the UK around April of 2019, including a trans boy who had his face cut open with a knife inside a public park, a case eerily similar to what happened to Brianna. Thankfully, said boy survived. I would reference this directly whilst calling out the gross transmisia in the secular community which sought to paint trans women as an intrinsic threat, and whilst you might hope that trans youth would be spared such fear-mongering, that was not the case. Bigots attacked both Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, two black trans girls who, at the time, were the same age as Brianna. They were both demonized as an extreme threat to white cis women. Why? Well, because they had the audacity to run in an open track competition that had designated itself ahead of time as being trans inclusive. Going after trans youth has always been on the agenda, they just tested their means on black trans youth first. And so I use these cases to explain that when you present trans people as an inherent danger to anything, be it sports, bathrooms, or support services, all that hate, that hysteria, ultimately feeds the same reservoir. I warned that unless we change the way we act, things were just going to keep getting worse in the UK, a crime for which I was labelled an alarmist and slandered as a fucking radical. Yet look where we are now. What's worse is, we are not alone in this struggle. This hatred is international, with transphobic talking points being imported and exported like a commodity. The US is in the midst of its own trans hysteria and the incredible violence that defines it. In March of 2022, we lost Katie Newhouse, an Asian American trans girl murdered by her father. In April of 2022, we lost Ariana Mitchell, a black trans girl, murdered whilst protecting a friend after she was questioned by the shooter about her gender. Then, in February of 2023, less than a week before Brianna, we lost Sashay Imanatuitaho, a black trans woman murdered by a co-worker. These are just a few of the people we have lost recently, and don't even get me started on the deluge of anti-trans bills. Returning to the UK, the response to Brianna's murder shows us exactly how we got here. The Sunday Times openly engaging in transmisic violence by dead-naming a murdered girl. UK councillors engaging in ableist and transmisic victim blaming. People spamming memorial posts to Brianna with promotional materials for Hogwarts Legacy. All of it proves everything I have been saying about anti-trans hate in the UK. Society didn't get here by accident, it was pushed. So to see the very people responsible for this hatred rush to distance themselves from the transmisic abuse Brianna was put through, crying out that they cannot be blamed unless her murder was motivated by anti-trans hate, completely erasing the years of torment that this poor girl was made to endure, is fucking disgraceful. Even in the extremely unlikely event that Brianna wasn't murdered because she was trans, you are still responsible for so much blood. Not just in this girl's life, but the lives of so many trans people, including trans children. And speaking of responsibility, it's time we finally bring all of this together in explaining how Cheshire Police are potentially responsible for the murder of Brianna Ghey. Returning to what Brianna's friends told the press, not only was she a victim of anti-trans hate crime at school, having been physically assaulted for years, but one stated, quote, her high school and Cheshire Police refused to intervene, end quote. This right here underscores the massive conflict of interest that exists in allowing Cheshire Police to investigate whether or not Brianna's murder was motivated by anti-trans hate. If it turns out that the two people currently suspected of murdering her were among those that targeted and physically assaulted Brianna at school, that would mean police were not only aware that Brianna was being tortured and refused to act, but that said inaction directly enabled her murder. Add to this the fact that said murder was not some unforeseeable escalation, with there being plenty of historical evidence of this sort of thing happening before. What then would that mean for Cheshire Police? Well, aside from the fact that this constitutes gross negligence manslaughter, with Brianna's death being the foreseeable result of a grossly negligent, though otherwise lawful, omission on the part of the police, one would hope, at the very least, whichever staff were responsible would be fired. I don't think that's a particularly radical position to take on the subject of police allowing a 16-year-old to be tortured to death because she was trans. But Ethel, you're getting ahead of yourself. Cheshire Police haven't even confirmed that Brianna's murder was motivated by anti-trans hate. Yes, and therein rests the problem. The people, and I use that word in the most broad sense, the people currently investigating Brianna's murder are the very same people potentially responsible, in part, for said murder. That means the police are effectively being allowed to investigate themselves for their criminality. It doesn't take a law degree to spot the conflict of interest. Because even if the police currently assigned to Brianna's case aren't the same people that ignored her being physically assaulted at school for all those years, they still know each other. They still probably go to one another's birthdays and meet down at the pub for a quick pint. Even if they personally don't like the officer whose job it is on the line, even if they have no desire to protect said officer, they could never risk actually reporting on the case impartially and getting said person fired, because the rest of the police force will almost certainly punish them for the perceived transgression of selling out a fellow officer. Everything the police do in this case comes back to that canteen culture discussed earlier. If faced with the choice between accurately reporting on whether something was a hate crime, potentially getting themselves or a colleague fired, or protecting their colleagues by omitting key details, not following up on lines of investigation, and even leading key witnesses away from said conclusion, you can fucking guarantee that police officers will pick the latter. What makes the issue even more complicated is the fact that the conflict of interest here goes beyond the local police force. UK police are facing what can be politely described as a PR crisis. Recent scandals, the most notable of which is perhaps the rape and murder of Sarah Everard by a British police officer, have had a drastic impact on the public's perception of the force. To make matters worse, the UK government has recently passed a bill giving police the power to arrest protesters for being a nuisance, and is currently seeking to give the police even more powers via the anti-strike bill. So not only do members of the Cheshire Police risk losing their jobs if it is discovered that they allowed a 16-year-old girl to be tortured to death for being trans, but each scandal the British police force is involved in is a potential spark point for the British people to say, enough is enough, this isn't working, we need deep-rooted systemic change. A sentiment that is very much not in the interest of the people currently working for the UK police force on all levels. To understand the potential backlash the police face if it is discovered that they could have prevented Brianna's murder, just look at how angry the general public was when they found out that Wayne Couzens, the officer who had raped Sarah Everard, had been nicknamed the Rapist by his fellow officers, and that he had a repeated history of indecent exposure, which was hand-waved by the UK police force as unimportant. With the exception of marginalised people, I have never seen the British public so angry at police. Hell, I've even had family members I never thought would utter a bad word about police saying some pretty radical things in response to that. So to add the death of a 16-year-old girl that police knew was being tortured for years and yet did nothing to protect, I think we can all see the likely impact such a scandal would have. That image of the friendly neighbourhood Bobby that the police force has spent so long and hard cultivating is already starting to crack, and I think that makes them more dangerous than ever. The police have every reason to lie, both on the ground and up on high. And what's worse is, they have the capacity to do so. Why do I say that? Well, the truth of the matter is, this should already be a national scandal. A girl was tortured for years, physically assaulted by groups of students, whilst the police chose to do nothing. Even if you're a reformist, someone still holding onto the fantasy that you can fix canteen culture, surely you should be out on the street demanding that heads roll in order to set an example. But you're not, because the police force has convinced you that the most important thing right now is whether or not the murder was a hate crime, a verdict that, coincidentally, they get to decide. That's why most people are just nodding politely whilst they let police investigate the murder of Brianna Ghey, a crime the police force itself is potentially complicit in. So I guess the big question is, what do we do about it? How can we pull ourselves out of the hole we've been pushed into? I wish I had a nice neat answer to give you. Something simple, something solid. Truth is, I've been struggling to write a conclusion to this piece. Every attempt I make either feels wishy-washy or completely nihilistic. It is infinitely frustrating to be a trans person who has spent years screaming at the top of her lungs about the way things in the UK are heading, only to be ignored. It is no coincidence that I finally pushed myself to see a psychiatrist the week following Brianna's murder and was immediately put on antidepressants. Just reading about Brianna's story, the way she was treated at school, how officials did absolutely nothing, it made me feel so incredibly isolated. Like the trans community has just been completely abandoned. It's in that darkness that I find myself asking, how can one hope in the face of absolute hopelessness? How can one dream in a world built from nightmares? To be caught up in a trap where even the slightest mistake causes nothing but excruciating agony. But what choice do I have? There needs to be a third-party investigation into Brianna's case. That much is certain. The police cannot be allowed to investigate their own criminality. Said investigation needs to look into the many times Brianna Ghey was physically assaulted at school, as well as why, according to her friends, Cheshire Police did absolutely nothing. Furthermore, once that investigation has concluded and the people responsible have been found, they need to be held to account just as much as the people who stabbed her. Justice is the first step towards allowing Brianna to rest in peace. We also need to make sure that this never happens again. We need better systems inside our schools to tackle anti-trans hate, actual policies that help children understand and respect the differences in their peers. Programs like Andrew Moffat's No Outsiders are more important now than ever in counteracting the hate being preached en masse by mainstream media. That's where we can start before moving out into the workplace and wider society. We need to make it so that we aren't reliant on police to deal with anti-trans hate crime, because the police are not the solution to this. They never have been, a fact clearly borne out by the hate crime statistics shown earlier. We need local alternatives that actually protect trans people whilst we withdraw consent from an institution that has done nothing but cause us further harm. On top of that, we need to start having serious conversations about anti-trans hate speech in the UK, which is another thing the police are currently holding ransom. We need to unite and shake down the UK government, demanding that they act on key figures promoting anti-trans violence on British soil. Key figures that include UK councillors and MPs of all major parties. This girl was tortured for years because the British public let it happen. There are too many people not wanting to rock boats, to make a scene, to actually defend trans lives when it is needed the most. Above all, we need society to start acknowledging the facts that trans lives mean a damn before they're over. To fight for trans life as much as they claim to mourn its loss. Because right now, it feels as if the message from both those who hate us and those claiming to be our allies is pretty much one and the same. That the only good trans person is a dead trans person. So many self-declared allies excuse themselves from the fight for trans rights only to turn up when one of us gets murdered in order to take a selfie posing over a gravestone for personal clout. Well, I'm here to give you a reality check. Calling yourself an ally isn't enough. Your regards for our dead mean nothing if you don't actively fight for the living. She didn't deserve to be murdered. She deserved to live. She deserved to laugh and cry, to love and be loved. All those things and so much more. She deserved them all. And her name was Brianna Ghey. If you or anyone you know has been impacted by anti-trans hate crime and feel the need to reach out, Gallop is a UK-based support charity which offers help to LGBT+ folk who have experienced violence. A link to their webpage detailing all the ways you can contact them will be included at the top of the video description. We'll also be linking a support services master list put together by LGBT Hero containing a wealth of other resources, including helplines for those suffering from suicidal ideation. So please do check out said resources if you need support. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Gert Van Vorst, Hannah Banghart, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. For as dark as things might seem, you are not alone.